Picture this. Both of your arms are soaked in blood, wrist to elbow. It's dripping off your fingertips onto the floor. And you are just sitting there, waiting. Because your teacher told you that you needed her permission to leave the room, and she wasn't going to give it until she finished her lecture. This isn't a horror story. This is a Tuesday afternoon in a public high school. And by the end of it, that teacher's face would go white as a bedsheet and school policy would change forever. If you've ever had someone in a position of power look you dead in the eye and decide that their control mattered more than your well-being, this story is for you. Stick around, because the ending of this one isn't just satisfying, it's almost hard to believe. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and let's get into it. Let's rewind. Our protagonist, we'll call her Mia, because every good story needs a name, was a pretty average high schooler in almost every way. Good grades, good attendance, the kind of student teachers usually liked because she didn't cause trouble, except for one thing about Mia's body that she never asked for and could never control. High blood pressure, and along with it, nosebleeds. Not the kind you get from picking at your nose in dry winter air, the kind that turn a classroom into a crime scene. These weren't rare, either. They happened often enough that the school had basically built a protocol around Mia specifically. On more than one occasion, her nose bled for so long and so heavily that state law required the school to physically send her home, because at a certain point, that much blood loss stops being a let her go to the nurse problem and starts being a call the parents right now problem. Every teacher Mia had ever had understood this. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't something she had to explain over and over. Teacher after teacher, year after year, had the same message for her. The second your nose starts bleeding, get up and go. Don't wait. Don't ask. Just go. Every teacher, except one, the antagonist. Enter Mrs. Halden, a teacher with a reputation that preceded her into every new semester. She ran her classroom less like an educator and more like a general running a courtroom. Her rule, stated on day one of every single class, every single year, was ironclad. No one interrupts her lecture. No one leaves without her explicit permission. Not for the bathroom. Not for a question. Not for anything. Now, on its own, that's just a strict teacher. Strict isn't evil. But here's the thing about people who build their entire identity around control. They don't like exceptions. And Mia's medical situation? That was an exception Mrs. Holden had decided. Somewhere in her head, she simply wasn't going to make. Mia sat in her class, day after day, quietly watching Mrs. Holden shut down other students' questions mid-sentence with a raised hand and an icy, "I'm not finished." It was uncomfortable to watch. It made your stomach tighten a little, that low-grade anxiety of please don't call on me, please don't need anything from her. Mia had a bad feeling about this class from week one. She just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. The incident begins. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Mia was taking notes, pen moving across the page, half listening the way you do in your fourth class of the day, when she felt it. That familiar, sinking warmth at the back of her nose. She knew that feeling instantly. Years of experience had turned her into an expert diagnostician of her own body, and this diagnosis was never good news. She reached up instinctively and pinched the bridge of her nose. But she was already a beat too late. In the handful of seconds it took her to register what was happening, blood had already dripped onto her notebook, blooming across the ink like spilled paint. And this one, she could tell immediately, was bad, even for her. Calmly, because calm was the only setting Mia had after years of practice, she raised her hand. She waited. Mrs. Holden's eyes flicked toward her. And then, nothing. The lecture continued. Not a pause. Not an acknowledgement. Just the steady, uninterrupted drone of a woman who had seen a raised hand and decided it simply wasn't her problem yet. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Mia's hand stayed up, blood now sliding warm and steady over her fingers, pooling in her palm where she pinched her nose shut. 5 minutes. The other students were starting to notice. Quick, nervous glances thrown her way, the kind of look that says someone should say something while nobody actually says anything. Finally, a full 5 to 10 minutes after Mia had first raised her hand, Mrs. Holden pointed a finger at her without breaking stride. "I'll answer your question after I've finished. here's where the story shifts. Because most people in Mia's position would have panicked, would have blurted out, "Mrs. Holden, I'm bleeding. I need to go now," would have caused the very interruption they'd been trained not to cause. But Mia didn't do that. Instead, something quieter and colder settled into her chest. A decision. If Mrs. Holden wanted to pretend this was just a question, fine. Mia would let her keep pretending, right up until she couldn't anymore. There's a particular kind of petty resolve that comes from being underestimated one too many times, and Mia felt it settle over her like armor. "You want to make me wait? I'll wait. Let's see how long you're willing to let this go." So she sat, and she bled. The escalation. What followed was one of the most quietly harrowing scenes you can imagine happening in a classroom full of teenagers pretending to take notes. Mia kept her head tilted back, one hand clamped over her nose, blood running steadily down her wrist and forearm in thin red rivers. She could feel it pooling at her elbow, could feel the warm drip as it left her skin entirely and started hitting the desk. Tap, 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 a quiet, wet metronome underneath Mrs. Holden's voice. At one point, her right hand was so soaked that she made a decision only someone who'd been through this 100 times before could make so matter-of-factly. She switched hands, not because the bleeding was slowing, because she'd rather ruin her own sleeve than let it drip onto the floor where someone else would have to step in it later. Even mid-crisis, some deeply ingrained part of her was still thinking about everyone else in the room. Around her, classmates' pens had stopped moving. Nobody was taking notes anymore. Whispers passed between desks in quick, darting glances toward Mia, then toward the front of the room, then back to their laps. Nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to be the one to interrupt Mrs. Holden either. Minutes stretched on like taffy. 5 more. Blood dried and cracked, dark lines across her knuckles while fresh blood kept coming underneath it. Her notebook was ruined. Her sleeve was soaked through to the elbow. And Mrs. Holden lectured on, oblivious. Or worse, choosing to be oblivious. Completely unaware that the girl in the 3rd row was quietly, calmly bleeding out in front of 30 witnesses. Finally, after what had been, in total, close to 15 minutes since Mia's hand first went up, Mrs. Holden wrapped up her lecture. She turned, scanned the room, found Mia, and asked with the casual tone of someone who thought she was doing her student a favour, "So, was your question already answered by the lecture?" Silence. Mia stood up, and the entire classroom saw it at once. Both of her hands were slick with blood, dried in some places, still glistening wet in others. It had run down to her elbows. It had soaked through her sleeve. It was smeared across her desk, dotted on the floor beneath her, staining the pages of her notebook a deep, rust-coloured red. Mia looked her dead in the eye, and in the same calm, level voice she'd used the entire time, she asked, "Can I be excused to go to the nurse's office?" Mrs. Holden's face drained of every last drop of colour. Her whole posture changed in an instant, the icy control gone, replaced by something close to panic. "Why on earth have you waited this long? Joe, go to the nurse's office, right now!" The classroom erupted into motion. Mrs. Holden. The same woman who moments earlier wouldn't let a hand raise interrupt her sentence, was suddenly shouting orders, sending one of Mia's friends sprinting down the hallway beside her, terrified she might collapse from blood loss before reaching the nurse. The irony hung in the air thick enough to taste. The exact crisis Mrs. Holden had refused to acknowledge for 15 minutes was now, apparently, a 5-alarm emergency. The second it became undeniable, the second it became her problem too. Mia, for her part, wasn't even thinking about herself in that moment. She was thinking about the janitor who'd have to clean the floor. That's how used to this she was. Word of what happened spread through that school faster than any rumour mill ever could. A girl bled through 2 shirt sleeves waiting on a teacher's permission to leave. That story didn't need embellishing. It was already unbelievable enough on its own. And the fallout wasn't just gossip. It was policy. Shortly after the incident, the school implemented a new rule, one that should have existed all along. No student needed permission to leave a classroom if they were bleeding. Full stop. No hand raising. No waiting. No teacher's discretion required. Mrs. Holden never publicly apologised. She didn't have to. Her own reaction, that instant, whiplash fast shift from icy control to panicked shouting, said everything that needed saying. She knew, in that moment, exactly how badly she'd messed up. The look on her face was the apology. Here's the thing about people who build their power on rigid control. They rarely think through what happens when their rules meet a reality bigger than them. Mrs. Holden thought she was the authority in that room. But biology doesn't ask permission. And in the end, it was Mia's calm, quiet refusal to panic. Her decision to simply let the consequences speak for themselves. That changed a school's policy for every student who came after her. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't loud. It's just letting someone sit in the exact situation they created until they can't ignore it anymore. If this story had you gripping your seat, smash that like button right now. And tell us in the comments. Have you ever had a teacher, boss, or authority figure who cared more about control than about you? We want to hear it. Subscribe for more stories just like this one, because trust me, this isn't the last time karma's going to show up right on schedule.